Ethiopians would later remember it as the moment when a border that had stood for centuries gave way in a single morning. On 3 October 1935, the northern horizon broke open under the sound of Italian artillery, and columns began to move across the frontier from Eritrea and Somaliland. For Rome, this was the start of a fast campaign that would modernize an ancient empire. For Ethiopia, it was the beginning of a struggle that would outlast armies, viceroys, and official declarations of victory. In the weeks before the invasion, the build-up had been unmistakable. Ships filled Massawa's docks, cranes lifting crates of ammunition beside rows of trucks waiting to be sent south. Newly expanded airfields hosted bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, their engines coughing to life at dawn as pilots prepared to map the Ethiopian Highlands. Italian engineers carved supply roads into ridges that had once been considered unreachable, giving their forces the logistical support they needed to move deep into the interior. Everything pointed toward a war designed to be fast, organized, and modern, an approach Italy believed Ethiopia could not match. On the Ethiopian side, mobilization arrived with urgency and uneven resources. Messages rode through the highlands to summon regional levies, men who carried rifles inherited from earlier conflicts, others armed only with old muskets or spears. Traditional command structures based on nobles, local chiefs, and a long military heritage were still intact, but they were forced to respond to an invasion planned with modern coordination. Ras Imru Haile Selassie, one of the empire's most experienced commanders, tried to concentrate his forces while also defending an immense frontier. The army had courage and numbers. What it lacked was the equipment to counter aircraft, tanks, and motorized artillery, advancing along engineered roads. The early clashes showed the scale of that imbalance. Battles around Abe Aragai and later at Maychew revealed Ethiopian determination, but they also showed how destructive Italian air power could be. Pilots circled above the ridges, dropping explosives on formations that had little protection beyond scattered rocks and steep terrain. Reports from the time described clouds drifting across valleys after air attacks, chemical agents used in violation of international law, turning the landscape into an unpredictable threat. Italian columns supported by Eritrean askaris, who knew the region's terrain well, pushed forward with steady momentum. Still, the advance was not uncontested. Ethiopian forces used their knowledge of the land to slow Italian progress, drawing enemy units into narrow passes and attacking supply caravans whenever opportunities arose. Local communities gave grain, shelter, and information, supporting fighters who moved between camps in the highlands. But by early 1936, the pressure mounted. Italian machinery and firepower created gaps that were impossible to close quickly, and more of the imperial army was forced into retreat. The turning point arrived at Maychew in late March 1936, when Haile Selassie personally commanded the defense. The battle became a symbol of the empire's determination, a final attempt to stop an enemy that had crossed mountain chains and valleys in less than 6 months. But the Italian advantage was overwhelming. Their aircraft bombed Ethiopian positions relentlessly, and their motorized units outflanked defensive lines. The retreat after Maychew, marked by exhaustion and dwindling supplies, left the capital exposed. By 5 May 1936, Italian troops entered Addis Ababa. Reports described the city filled with smoke from looted shops and the pressure of tens of thousands of civilians trying to avoid the confusion of the occupation. Haile Selassie, after consulting advisors, made the decision to leave the country, not as an act of surrender, but as a political choice. From abroad, he believed he could gather diplomatic pressure against Italy and perhaps secure support that was unavailable at home. His departure was heavy with symbolism, but many understood its purpose. The struggle was no longer only on battlefields, it would also unfold in speeches and international appeals. Within days, Italy declared victory. Mussolini announced that Ethiopia had been absorbed into a new Italian empire. Posters and broadcasts spoke of pacification, of roads stretching into the highlands, and of authority restored. But the countryside did not match these claims. In the mountains beyond Shoa, in the forests of Gojam, and in the valleys of Tigray, the sense of defeat was mixed with something more enduring: refusal. Some of the first to resist were men who had walked home from broken front lines. Others were landholders, clergy, or former officials who rejected the idea of a foreign ruler. Civilians, shocked by the occupation's early policies, forced labor demands, disarmament orders, and the arrival of unfamiliar administrators, began helping those who moved through the hills with weapons hidden beneath their cloaks. Even before the empire had fully fallen, networks of defiance were starting to form. In Geneva, Haile Selassie delivered an appeal to the League of Nations that echoed far beyond the hall where he spoke. He described the invasion, the methods used, and the danger of ignoring a small nation's sovereignty. His plea did not reverse the occupation, but it preserved Ethiopia's legitimacy in the eyes of many and planted doubts about Italy's claim of total control. That claim would soon face a deeper test. In the highlands, scattered fighters began to find one another. Messages traveled along church roads and through valleys untouched by Italian patrols. The occupiers held the capital, the main roads and the administrative centers, but not the silence gathering in the hills. The empire, on paper, had collapsed. But across Ethiopia, thousands were preparing to decide whether its spirit had fallen with it, or whether the confrontation now entering view would reshape the occupation entirely. The Italians expected the highlands to settle into silence, an occupied calm enforced by new governors, roadblocks and official orders. But by mid-1936, the silence they encountered was of a different kind, the quiet of men moving at night, of messengers traveling by mountain footpaths, of villages weighing whether to obey the new rulers or support those who refused. The occupation had taken the capital, but it had not taken the country's sense of identity. Across the landscape, survivors of the imperial armies were the first to regroup. Many had returned home after defeats at Abe Aragai and Maychew, carrying weapons worn down from the retreat. They arrived exhausted, but the familiarity of their own valleys and ridges restored something the front lines had drained, the knowledge that geography could be protection, and that a foreign mechanized army might struggle in terrain where local fighters could disappear within minutes. These men, scattered at first across Shoa, Tigray and Gojam, began forming small circles of trust. No formal banners, no official commands, only shared experience and shared refusal. What allowed these circles to grow was not military structure, but the quiet support of Ethiopian society. Clergy opened monastery doors after dark, offering shelter and bread. Landholders supplied fighters from harvest stores and sent messages across hills where Italian patrols rarely ventured. Provincial nobles used old alliances to organize meetings under the cover of religious festivals or community gatherings. The Orthodox Church, deeply woven into daily life, provided courtyards where whispered plans could form and couriers could slip unnoticed among worshippers. Each action was small and deliberate, invisible to Italian authorities who assumed control rested in the capital. As support networks formed, the first guerrilla tactics emerged. Fighters began cutting telegraph lines strung hastily by Italian engineers, leaving patrols to navigate without communication. Night raids targeted remote outposts, forcing garrisons to tighten into their fortified posts instead of extending authority outward. Ambushes struck supply convoys on predictable routes. A single truck overturned on a mountain road could delay an entire column. These operations were not large-scale battles, but they unsettled an occupying force that expected obedience. Italian officers noted that the countryside did not respond to pacification as expected, a restrained phrase hiding growing frustration. The terrain intensified that frustration. The Ethiopian highlands were a maze of cliffs, forests, volcanic plateaus, and narrow valleys that no Italian map could accurately capture. Roads built for convoys could be watched from heights where patriots lay hidden. Villages loyal during the day might close their doors at night, leaving patrols unsure which settlements stored grain for fighters and which feared punishment too much to offer help. Italian posts, solid structures of stone and sandbags, became isolated islands in a landscape they did not fully understand. Holding them required manpower, and each attack pulled more soldiers away from roads and towns to guard lonely positions. By early 1937, the movement began to take clearer shape. Among its rising leaders was Abe Aragai, a man who knew the Shoa highlands so well that he could move between villages faster than Italian forces could track. His networks were not armies but webs, runners carrying his instructions across ridges, elders informing him of Italian movements, and fighters shifting between cells so no capture could destroy the whole structure. In Gojam, figures like Haile Selassie formed their own centers of influence, though the Italians had not yet recognized them as major threats. The Patriots did not speak with one voice, but their actions, scattered yet persistent, showed that resistance was evolving from instinct into strategy. Italy responded by tightening control. Patrols grew more frequent, curfews stricter, and local collaborators known as bandas were appointed as intermediaries. The bandas were meant to help identify resistors, but they also created deep suspicion within communities, straining long-standing relationships. For every village that cooperated, another quietly resented the intrusion. And for every banda that provided information, another feared Patriot retaliation. The occupation's attempts to build authority often weakened it instead. Food shortage became an early test. Harvest interruptions, forced requisitions, and the displacement of farmers created pressure across several provinces. Resistance fighters depended on communities already struggling to survive. Many patriots went hungry, adjusting their operations to match the rhythm of scarcity, moving in smaller groups, eating sparingly, and timing raids to capture supplies without harming the villagers who supported them. It was a reminder that resistance carried costs felt equally by civilians and fighters. Still, the movement grew. Ethiopians who had watched the invasion from fields and markets began to see the occupation not as an unchangeable reality, but as something contested. Rumors of successful ambushes traveled quickly. The sight of armed patriots on remote trails, glimpsed by shepherds or travelers, nurtured quiet confidence that the struggle had not ended with the fall of the capital. Even neutral villagers found themselves pulled toward the idea that Ethiopia had not been fully subdued. By late 1936, resistance was no longer just a reaction to invasion. It was becoming a national feeling carried along roads, in prayers, and in shared stories. Italian garrisons reported increased activity in the hills, but struggled to identify leaders or predict attacks. The occupation's machinery, its roads, airplanes, and administrative offices seemed increasingly at odds with a countryside answering with patience, knowledge of the land, and a determination that did not need large battles to prove itself. But the movement, still decentralized, had not yet faced the moment that would turn scattered defiance into a nationwide uprising. That moment would come in February 1937, triggered not by strategy, but by a single act in a crowded courtyard, an explosion that would reshape the occupation entirely. On the morning of February 1937, Addis Ababa gathered for what was meant to be a ceremony of charity. Crowds filled the courtyard of the Gideon Lual Palace, waiting to receive alms, marking the birth of the Prince of Naples. Among them stood two young Ethiopians who had entered quietly. When Viceroy Rodolfo Graziani stepped forward, they threw grenades toward the platform. The blasts echoed against palace walls, scattering dust and panic. Graziani survived, wounded but alive. The Italians called it terrorism. For many Ethiopians, it became the spark that turned quiet resistance into open revolt. What followed shocked even those familiar with harsh occupation. Italian forces, enraged and fearful, launched reprisals across Addis Ababa that lasted for days. Reports from the time, varying in detail, but consistent in scale, describe homes burned, civilians forced into the streets, and neighborhoods targeted without distinction. The violence spread beyond the capital. Monasteries, seen by Italians as potential shelters for rebels, were raided or destroyed. Italy justified these actions as security measures. Ethiopians understood them as a warning. The occupation would permit no neutrality, no hidden dissent. But the reprisals produced an opposite result. Thousands fled the capital afterward, leaving behind markets, workshops, and homes. Many went directly into the countryside, carrying stories of what had happened in Addis Ababa. Their accounts traveled through Gojam's valleys, Shoa's plateaus, and Tigray's slopes, sharpening a sense of urgency that earlier months had not created. Farmers, clergy, and former soldiers who had hesitated now saw rebellion as the only alternative to submission. If the capital could be punished without warning, no quiet village could assume safety. The Patriots suddenly gained new volunteers, people who had never fought before but now saw no other choice. Experienced fighters taught newcomers how to move silently through forests, how to avoid leaving tracks on mountain paths, and how to divide into small groups before dawn to confuse Italian patrols. Resistance, once scattered, began to expand with speed. Ethiopian society, once strained but intact, started to reshape itself around the idea of shared defiance. Italian authorities strengthened their approach to control. Graziani ordered the expansion of fortified posts, each surrounded by trenches and watchtowers. Mobile columns patrolled daily, trucks loaded with infantry moving alongside armored cars. Aircraft flew frequent reconnaissance missions over suspected Patriot zones. Curfews lengthened, and civilians were required to carry identification papers. The goal was clear: turn Ethiopia from an occupied territory into one under tight surveillance. Even so, the countryside resisted. Fortified posts protected the roads but not the huge spaces around them. Patriots moved through ravines, forests, and cliffs where vehicles could not follow. Runners carried messages between villages faster than telegraph lines could be restored. Italian efforts to gather intelligence through bandas created as many problems as they solved. Some informants lied to protect relatives, others exaggerated threats for payment. The informant network became unreliable. distorted by fear and conflicting loyalties. Urban resistance grew as well. Though heavily monitored, Addis Ababa remained a hub for quiet coordination. Ethiopians who stayed in the city operated safe houses for couriers from the countryside. Students, clerks, and craftsmen acted as observers, reporting troop movements through coded notes or whispered signals. Messages slipped through surveillance gaps, hidden in pottery shipments, grain bundles, or carried by trusted church messengers. These networks did not launch attacks, but they sustained them, giving patriots the information needed to evade or confront Italian units. By late 1937, the occupation had entered an uneasy contradiction. Official broadcasts announced that Ethiopia was pacified, that resistance had been crushed. Maps displayed in public squares showed control spreading across the entire territory. But internal military reports admitted that Italy held the roads, not the land. Every valley seemed to hide new fighters, every monastery a possible meeting point, every forest a shelter beyond reach. The more the occupation tightened its grip, the more resistance slipped away. Reprisals meant to intimidate instead, increased patriot numbers. Fortifications meant to secure the country drained troops from other areas, and the image of total dominance clashed with the daily reality of an unrest that would not disappear. By year's end, the patriots were no longer just reacting, they were shaping the conditions of the occupation. Italy could not predict its movements, nor could it regain the confidence it had once held, but even as the patriots gained strength, the struggle's next phase would depend on events far beyond Ethiopia's borders, events forming in Europe that would soon tilt the balance. Italy's maps told a reassuring story. Thick lines marking fortified routes, shaded regions labelled pacified, and symbols denoting secure posts stretching from Addis Ababa to the northern highlands. But anyone who walked those mountains knew that maps could lie. By 1938, the Italian occupation had reached its administrative peak, yet real control over Ethiopia remained elusive. The empire declared victory. The countryside quietly contradicted it. In the province of Gojam, that contradiction became unmistakable. Here, Haile Selassie emerged as a figure whose influence unsettled Italian commanders. A former prisoner who had escaped captivity, he had become a leader through a mixture of boldness, discipline, and a deep understanding of his homeland's terrain. In villages scattered across ridges and valleys, his word carried weight. Fighters rallied to him not because he promised victory, but because he embodied refusal. Under his guidance, Gojam gradually transformed into a semi-autonomous patriot zone where Italian officials traveled only in heavily guarded convoys if they traveled at all. This transformation unfolded slowly but decisively. Patriots sabotaged roads that Italian engineers labored to maintain, blocking routes with felled trees or rock slides triggered from cliff edges. Ambushes struck supply caravans at bends where trucks had to slow, forcing Italian columns to allocate more troops simply to move from one post to another. Collaborators were targeted in operations carried out without spectacle or cruelty. Swift, deliberate acts meant to discourage others from aligning with the occupiers. These attacks were not large battles, but they accumulated into a persistent pressure that drained resources and morale. Italian commanders faced a strategic dilemma. They had enough manpower to hold towns and major roads, but not enough to garrison vast rural territories. The countryside stretched in every direction, on a scale that frustrated even the most ambitious surveillance plans. To compensate, the Italians built a system of fortified posts, small, self-contained compounds connected by roads that were supposed to form the skeleton of control. Each post was equipped with sandbags, barbed wire, a telegraph station, and a small garrison whose primary task was endurance. Yet endurance was not victory. These posts became points of isolation, often surrounded by patriots who observed them from distant hillsides. Soldiers stationed inside lived with a sense of being watched, never knowing when a supply convoy might be delayed by sabotage or when a patrol might vanish after leaving the perimeter. Archival reports note growing anxiety among Italian officers as the gap widened between what plans demanded and what the terrain allowed. Meanwhile, the patriots adapted their tactics. In Tigray and Shoa, resistance movements operated independently but shared a common intent. They struck at night, withdrew by dawn, and relied on geography to erase their footprints. Rumors of their movements spread quickly through the population. At markets and water points, whispers passed along the paths, which roads were safe, which units had moved, which villages had been searched. These exchanges were not organized communications, yet they formed a network that allowed resistance groups to act with surprising coordination. To counter this, the Italians expanded their informant system, recruiting locals who supplied intelligence in exchange for protection or payment. But information gathered under coercion or fear was often inconsistent. Some informants withheld details to protect relatives, others exaggerated threats to earn rewards. The occupation's efforts to read the countryside produced reports filled with contradictions, leaving commanders unsure whether they were responding to genuine danger or shadows. At the same time, resistance continued to gain meaning beyond military action. In many communities, supporting the Patriots became a symbol of dignity at a moment when everyday life felt increasingly constrained. As Italy raised new taxes, requisitioned livestock, and enforced labor requirements, resentment deepened. Even those who were not fighters contributed in quieter ways, offering shelter, refusing to give accurate information to patrols, or sending grain into the hills under the pretext of routine trade. Such acts created a moral economy of resistance, one that the occupation could not easily suppress. While the struggle intensified in Ethiopia, events in Europe began shifting the balance. The late 1930s brought rising tensions across the continent, and foreign observers began re-evaluating Italy's presence in East Africa. British officials, still cautious, noted that Ethiopia's persistent resistance demonstrated the region's instability. Though no formal support had yet been offered, messages from Ethiopian exiles found more attentive audiences in London and Khartoum. The Patriots did not know it at the time, but the geopolitical landscape around them was changing. Italian propaganda, however, insisted that the empire was secure. Radio broadcasts proclaimed that all major regions were under effective control, that roads were open, and that rebels were dwindling. Maps were printed showing Ethiopia shaded in uniform colors, suggesting that resistance existed only in remote pockets. But letters from Italian officers told a different story. Complaints about endless patrol duties, ambushes that struck without warning, and the strain of trying to hold land that refused to be held. By June 1940, when Italy entered the Second World War, the occupation was already stretched thin. The soldiers guarding Ethiopia were now part of a global conflict they were not prepared to fight. Fuel supplies tightened, reinforcements became uncertain, and communication lines grew more critical and more vulnerable. In the Highlands, patriots listened to the news of Italy's new war and understood its meaning. The occupiers' world had grown larger, their capacity to control Ethiopia had grown smaller. The resistance, shaped by years of hardship and adaptation, was poised for a new phase. The mountains, already familiar with Defiance, seemed to wait for the moment when external forces would shift the balance, and that moment was approaching, carried not by hidden couriers or midnight raids, but by events unfolding thousands of miles away, events that would soon open Ethiopia's struggle to allies beyond its borders. News of Italy's entry into the wider war reached Ethiopia not through official proclamations, but through whispers carried from garrisons, traders, and borderlands. On 10 June 1940, the conflict that had begun as a colonial conquest became part of a global struggle, and in that shift lay an opening the Patriots had long waited for. The occupation's machinery, already strained by years of resistance, now belonged to a belligerent fighting on multiple fronts. And beyond Ethiopia's borders, in exile, Haile Selassie recognized that the diplomatic window he had sought since 1936 had finally begun to open. In London, the emperor's appeals, once acknowledged politely but without commitment, gained new relevance. British planners in East Africa understood that Italy's territories, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somaliland, were suddenly strategic vulnerabilities. Their supply lines were long, their garrisons thin, and their communications dependent on roads. Patriots had spent years disrupting. When Selassie renewed his request for aid, the question was no longer whether Britain should support Ethiopia, but how quickly it could be done. From Sudan, the first steps of collaboration took shape. British officers studied Italian positions, gathering intelligence from Ethiopian refugees and border patrols. Among these officers was Orde Wingate, a man whose unconventional approach to warfare matched the landscape he was about to enter. Wingate had a reputation for bold ideas and impatient energy. In Ethiopia's Patriots, he saw a force that did not need to be built, only organized, coordinated, and supplied. In late 1940, Wingate formed a small composite force known as Gideon Force. It included British and Sudanese soldiers, but its core strength lay in the Patriots it intended to support. The aim was not to behave like a traditional army. Gideon Force would act as a catalyst, amplifying local momentum rather than overshadowing it. Its commanders carried wireless sets, maps, and the authority to coordinate with resistance leaders who had fought for years with little external guidance. Haile Selassie himself travelled from exile to Sudan, preparing to re-enter his country alongside the forces gathering there. Those who met him described a man worn by years of displacement yet sustained by purpose. He understood that his return would be symbolic, but symbols mattered. For patriots in the Highlands, hearing that the emperor was nearing the border was a reassurance that their struggle had not been forgotten by the outside world. As Wingate's planning advanced, the patriots revived old networks and created new ones. Messages spread discreetly through monasteries and marketplaces, informing fighters that support was on the way. Leaders such as Abe Aragai and Haile Selassie prepared their regions for coordinated action. They reorganized patrols, stockpiled grain where possible, and mapped Italian positions with the careful precision of those who had learned the rhythm of occupation. Years of resistance had taught them when to remain invisible and when to strike. The coming offensive would require both skills. Not all interactions between British officers and Ethiopian leaders were smooth. Cultural differences, divergent priorities, and the long shadow of earlier foreign interventions created moments of tension. Some patriots suspected that British motives were strategic rather than humanitarian. Some British officers underestimated the depth of Ethiopian resistance that had survived without their help. Yet necessity pushed both sides toward cooperation. Italy held the cities, the roads, and the administrative centers. The patriots held the countryside, and the British, planning incursions from Kenya and Sudan, needed that countryside to become a battlefield Italy could no longer ignore. Training sessions began along the Sudanese frontier. Gideon force introduced wireless communication, allowing for real-time coordination across distances that had previously required couriers to cover days of travel. They demonstrated how to plan ambushes around intelligence rather than opportunity, how to supply fighters through small mobile depots, and how to time operations so that pressure built simultaneously across multiple fronts. Patriots in turn taught the British how to read the contours of mountains, how to move without raising dust, and how to disappear into terrain that looked empty to unfamiliar eyes. The impact of Italy's overstretch grew clearer as 1940 ended. Italian forces in East Africa were expected to defend vast territories while their counterparts in North Africa fought the British along the desert frontier. Fuel shipments dwindled, spare parts became scarce, and the ability to reinforce isolated posts weakened with every passing month. Patriots who had once seen Italian convoys move with confidence now watched them proceed cautiously, wary of attacks that seemed to emerge from nowhere. By early January 1941, the balance had shifted. Italian commanders sensed that a major offensive was imminent, but lacked the resources to counter it. They ordered new fortifications, pulled troops back to key towns, and issued warnings to bands of collaborators whose loyalty seemed increasingly fragile. Local informants reported unfamiliar units gathering near the Sudanese border, British khaki alongside Ethiopian flags. In the Highlands, anticipation swept through villages that had lived under repression for nearly 5 years. Families hid grain for the patriots, children memorized messages they would deliver at dusk, and elders blessed fighters preparing to march. The resistance, once fragmented and reactive, was now prepared to move with purpose. Fighters who had grown accustomed to ambushes and night raids were about to take part in something far larger, an offensive planned in coordination with forces beyond Ethiopia's borders. And as the final nights of preparation settled over the Highlands, the Patriots and their new allies waited for their moment. Wingate studied his maps. Selassie prepared to reclaim his homeland. The Patriots counted the hours until they could rise from the mountains with the weight of 5 years behind them. The silence before the offensive was heavy, not with fear, but with the knowledge that the struggle was about to shift from survival to reclamation. January 1941 arrived with a cold clarity in the Highlands. For years, the Patriots had fought in scattered operations, ambushes at river crossings, sabotage along roads, sudden raids in the dark. Now, for the first time since the war began, those efforts were about to merge with a coordinated offensive launched from the outside. Gideon force, Haile Selassie, and the resistance leaders of Gojam and Shoa prepared to move as one. The struggle that had survived on endurance was shifting toward one built on momentum. The first operations began quietly. Gideon force slipped across the border from Sudan, traveling lightly with only what they could carry or pack onto mules. Their wireless sets crackled with messages to Patriot leaders who had been waiting for this signal. Across the Highlands, resistance fighters stirred from their concealed camps, gathering in groups larger than those used for years of hit-and-run warfare. They had none of the artillery or armored trucks that the Italians possessed, but they held something equally powerful: knowledge of the terrain and the confidence of those fighting on their own land. Early successes came in the form of outposts captured with surprising speed. Patriots cut telegraph lines, forcing Italian units to rely on couriers who struggled to navigate contested territory. Convoys moving between garrisons found themselves attacked at points long considered safe. Roads that had been difficult to hold now became nearly impossible to traverse without escort. The occupation's infrastructure, hard won over years of labor and fortified at great expense, was suddenly fragile. One of the pivotal moments of the campaign unfolded around Debre Marcos, a town whose position controlled access to routes stretching across Gojam. Italian commanders understood its importance and devoted significant manpower to its defense, but the Patriots, strengthened by Gideon forces' coordination, pressed the town from multiple approaches. Their attacks were not mass assaults but calculated strikes, blockading supply lines, isolating posts, and forcing Italian units into repeated withdrawals. As pressure increased, discipline within the garrison faltered. Reports describe arguments among officers, fears that relief would not arrive, and the realization that they were fighting in territory no longer under the control of the symbols on Italian maps. The fall of Debre Marcos marked a psychological turning point. Patriots who had once been forced to scatter at the sound of aircraft now watched Italian units retreat along the very roads they used to patrol. Each withdrawal sent tremors through the occupation system. Other garrisons, hearing of the defeat, began to question whether they could hold their positions. Local banders, whose loyalty had been uncertain for years, weighed the risk of staying aligned with an authority that no longer inspired confidence. Desertion spread quickly among Italian colonial troops. Many were Eritrean askaris who had been recruited years earlier and had no desire to fight a renewed offensive with dwindling supplies. Fuel shortages restricted the movement of armored cars, leaving them vulnerable on steep mountain passes. Ammunition had to be rationed. Even air support, once the decisive factor in Italy's victories, grew limited as maintenance problems accumulated and spare parts failed to reach the front. Some aircraft remained grounded for want of replacements, others flew missions shorter and less frequent than Italian strategy required. In the capital, anxiety deepened. Addis Ababa was still under occupation, but the signs of unraveling authority were visible. Officials began moving sensitive documents out of the city. Families connected to the administration prepared evacuation plans. Rumors spread that Patriot forces were approaching from multiple directions. Patrols that once strode confidently through the streets now scanned alleys with caution. The city's sense of inevitability, cultivated since 1936, was eroding. Across the highlands, the Patriots advanced with a mixture of determination and restraint. They knew the Italian retreat would be uneven, unpredictable. Some posts surrendered quickly, others held out desperately, fearing retribution if they yielded. The Patriots' aim was not destruction but displacement, to push an occupying force out of the country and restore the authority that had been taken by force. Their progress owed as much to morale as to tactics. Fighters who had spent years surviving in the shadows now marched openly, greeted by villagers who offered food, water, and prayers. Meanwhile, Allied victories in Eritrea reverberated through the Italian ranks. The defeat at Keren, one of the most brutal engagements of the East African campaign, sent a clear message. Italian East Africa was being cut apart from every direction. Gojam's Patriots had not fought at Keren, but their effect was felt there. Italy could not reinforce the front because resources had been drained, holding an interior that refused to stay subdued. By late April 1941, the days of the occupation were numbered. Italian administrators in Addis Ababa began evacuating northward, sending convoys toward Dessie and Gondar, towns they hoped to defend with the remnants of their forces. The roads leading out of the capital were filled with trucks carrying officials, soldiers, and the debris of an empire collapsing under internal and external pressure. On 5 May 1941, Haile Selassie entered Addis Ababa. The city he returned to was scarred but standing, the streets filled with people who emerged from homes and hiding places to witness the end of an era. For many, it was the first time they had seen the emperor since he left nearly 5 years earlier. His arrival signaled not only the collapse of Italian rule but the vindication of those who had fought in the hills, valleys, and forests without expectation of recognition. Yet the liberation was not the end of the struggle, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Across Ethiopia, displaced families searched for homes, communities counted losses, and former patriots attempted to transition from years of conflict into a state that needed rebuilding. And in the northern highlands, isolated pockets of Italian resistance continued to hold out, reminding everyone that even a fallen empire could cast a long shadow. But for the first time since 1936, Ethiopia stood on the cusp of self-determination. The occupation had broken not through a single battle but through years of defiance culminating in a coordinated offensive. The Patriots had spent half a decade fighting to survive. Now they would face the longer task of restoring the country that had endured so much in their absence. Liberation arrived with celebration, but its quiet aftermath revealed how deeply the years of occupation had reshaped Ethiopia. When Haile Selassie entered Addis Ababa on 5 May 1941, the capital erupted with relief, crowds following him through the streets, church bells ringing through neighborhoods that had lived in fear for half a decade. The emperor's return ended the most visible form of Italian rule, yet the work that followed would demand something different, not the courage of battle, but the patience to rebuild a country fragmented by war, famine, and repression. In the first weeks after the city changed hands, the re-establishment of government required a delicate balance. The imperial administration had to be restored quickly enough to provide stability, yet carefully enough to respect the sacrifices made by the patriots who had fought across the highlands. Some fighters expected recognition, others simply wanted to return to their homes. Aristocrats who had survived the occupation reclaimed estates and offices, while former officials who had fled or been dismissed now sought to resume their roles. The palace, once emptied of authority, filled again with advisors and envoys attempting to reassemble the machinery of state. But Ethiopia of 1941 was not the Ethiopia of 1936. Years of occupation had fractured loyalties and institutions. Communities that had learned to survive through resistance now had to adapt to centralized rule once more. Disarmament became one of the earliest challenges. Patriots carried weapons that had sustained them through years of hardship, and many hesitated to surrender the tools that had protected their villages. Some feared punishment for actions taken during the resistance. Others worried that unresolved tensions with collaborators might spark renewed conflict. The government issued decrees encouraging a peaceful handover, but the process unfolded unevenly across the provinces, shaped by local histories and personal grievances. Gojam, where Haile Selassie had established one of the most formidable resistance zones, was both a triumph and a source of tension. His authority during the occupation had been unquestioned by those who followed him, and his control of the region had been crucial to breaking Italian supply lines. But in peacetime, regional autonomy clashed with the centralizing instincts of the restored administration. Negotiations grew strained, and misunderstandings deepened. What had been unity in struggle became friction in governance, a reminder that victory on the battlefield does not dissolve political differences. Beyond questions of authority, the country's material condition demanded urgent attention. Entire villages had been burned during reprisals. Others had been emptied when families fled into the mountains. Terraces that once fed communities lay abandoned, overgrown or trampled by military columns. Roads built by the Italians connected towns but often bypassed the needs of rural people whose livelihoods depended on smaller paths and local markets. Famine pockets persisted where harvests had failed repeatedly. The Patriots, who had survived on minimal supplies, were now among the most vulnerable. Years spent in the hills had taken a toll on their health and resources. Reconstruction efforts began with limited means. Officials attempted to repair administrative buildings, reopen schools, and restore trade routes. Clergy helped reconnect parishes scattered by displacement, offering spiritual continuity where physical recovery lagged. Families searched for relatives lost during the conflict, sometimes learning that those who disappeared during reprisals or mass arrests had never returned. Public grief remained largely unspoken but felt everywhere, an undercurrent that shaped conversations in markets, between neighbors, and within households reuniting after separation. The legacy of occupation also forced difficult questions about accountability. Communities faced decisions about the bandas, local collaborators whose motivations ranged from coercion to self-preservation to genuine allegiance. Some sought forgiveness, others fled before judgment could reach them. The government urged restraint, but resentment ran deep. Many Ethiopians believed the wounds left by the occupation could not heal without acknowledging the roles played by those who aided the enemy. Yet pressing too hard risked igniting new cycles of violence at a moment when the country needed stability. Despite these tensions, there was an undeniable sense of renewal. Ethiopia's survival as an independent state, achieved against immense odds, resonated far beyond its borders. Newspapers across Africa and the Middle East wrote of a nation that not only had resisted colonial conquest, but had also reversed it. Leaders of emerging anti-colonial movements recognized Ethiopia's struggle as a symbol that foreign domination was not inevitable. The Patriots, once hidden in the hills, now found their stories traveling across regions where people still lived under imperial rule. In Addis Ababa, the emperor worked to rebuild diplomatic ties disrupted by the invasion. Foreign representatives returned to their embassies. Envoys carried messages across continents announcing Ethiopia's restored sovereignty. The country's position in global politics began to shift. Though still recovering from the war's devastation, Ethiopia stood as the only African state to emerge from the Second World War, having overthrown an occupying power. It was a powerful statement in an era when empires appeared unshakable, yet the scars of the occupation lingered. Families carried memories of reprisals that varied widely in scale and form. Villages remembered the years when silence was their only protection. Patriots who had lived as fighters struggled to adapt to routines free of danger. Children born during the war grew up hearing stories of landscapes shaped by fear and resilience. The war had ended, but its imprint remained on the people and the land. As 1941 drew to a close, Ethiopia stood at the threshold of a long process. The Patriots had achieved what many believed impossible. They had broken an empire through endurance and unity, supported in the final push by allies who recognized the justice of their cause. But liberation was not a final chapter, it was a beginning. The work ahead would require reimagining governance, restoring livelihoods, and healing divisions. And as the world moved toward the era of decolonization, Ethiopia's experience would echo as proof that resistance rooted in community, faith, and determination could alter the course of history. The country had reclaimed itself from foreign occupation. Now it faced the greater task of shaping the future that lay beyond the mountains where the Patriots once stood watch, waiting for their moment to return home. Let the story of Ethiopia's Patriots remind us how resilience can outlast even empires. Share this documentary, subscribe for more untold World War II histories, and join this channel's growing community of learners. Add your thoughts below. Your perspective keeps these stories alive.